You know, the Turin Shroud is probably one of the most studied and debated artifacts in all of human history. But today, we're not just going to rehash the same old arguments. No, we're going to dive deep into a fascinating scientific paper that claims to have found some absolutely stunning new evidence, hidden at the microscopic level, right inside the Shroud's most famous feature, its bloodstains.
For centuries, this simple piece of linen cloth has just captivated the world. It's got that faint, eerie double image of a crucified man, front and back. But beyond that mysterious image, it's the blood evidence, those reddish stains that basically map out a story of incredible suffering that a new paper by Dr. Giulio Fanti puts right under the microscope. And what it claims to reveal is a scientific puzzle that could challenge everything we thought we knew.
All right, so first things first, let's set the stage. Because you've got to understand, the Shroud isn't just a religious relic. It's a seriously complex scientific puzzle that has had researchers scratching their heads for decades.
The historical trail of this thing is long and, honestly, pretty spotty. We see features that look just like the face on the Shroud on coins from way back in the 7th century. Then it completely vanishes from Constantinople in 1204, only to pop back up in France over 100 years later. It even survived a fire before it finally found its permanent home in Turin, where it continues to be this object of intense fascination and debate.
Okay, so here's the real heart of the controversy. Back in 1988, radiocarbon dating tests were done, and they placed the cloth smack in the Middle Ages. A lot of people just said, see, it's a brilliant medieval fake. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. This paper throws a huge wrench in that conclusion. It suggests the sample they tested might have been contaminated or, and this is the wild part, that some kind of unknown event could have fundamentally changed the cloth's atomic structure, basically making that carbon date totally meaningless.
In this quote from the author, Dr. Falconti really just nails the argument. He's saying that because we have absolutely no idea how the body image even got there in the first place, we can't be sure that our normal dating methods even work on it. It's like a mystery wrapped inside of an enigma.
So, with all that context set, the paper pivots away from the whole dating argument and zooms right in on the physical evidence, the story that's literally written in the blood itself.
Now, even at a macroscopic level, just looking at it with your own eyes, the paper points out some incredible details. If you look at the wound in the side, the blood flow seems to have changed direction, which suggests the body was actually moved. And over on the arm, the analysis can tell the difference between different types of stains: blood that probably dried before death, blood that flowed after death, and even the clearer serum that separated out. It's a whole complex sequence of events just frozen in time on this cloth.
Now, get ready for a surprise. While the stains look pretty extensive, the paper calculates that a shockingly tiny amount of fluid was probably all it took to create them. How tiny? We're talking less than 10 cubic centimeters. That is less than a single tablespoon for all those stains.
So, okay, the quantity of blood is surprising. But the real story, the one this research is all about, isn't how much blood there is. It's what that blood is actually made of. And to see that, we have to go microscopic.
And folks, this is where the investigation just gets absolutely remarkable. The research claims to have found not just one, but 3 totally distinct types of blood particles, and each one tells a very different part of the story.
First, you've got what they call type A. These are countless little reddish particles that the paper identifies as extremely shrunken red blood cells, way smaller than they should be. The hypothesis here? This is post-mortem blood that has gone through some kind of extreme, maybe even unprecedented cellular stress.
Then you've got type B, which looks completely different. Think dark, brittle flakes. The paper suggests this is pre-mortem blood, so basically scabs that formed on wounds while the man was still alive and then later transferred over to the cloth.
And finally, there's a much rarer type C, particles that look like red blood cells, but they're only partially shrunken. The paper speculates these could be from an earlier stage of the trauma, before the body went through whatever extreme conditions created those tiny type A cells.
This table really makes the contrast crystal clear. You have 2 main, very different types of blood. The premortem type B is kind of what you'd expect: dark, clotted crusts. But the postmortem type A is something else entirely. It's made of shrunken microparticles, it's fluorescent, and, get this, it actually emits a form of radiation. So the big question is, what in the world could possibly cause all of this?
Well, the paper argues that these microscopic clues aren't just random. It claims they actually fit together to form a coherent medical story of a body that suffered extreme systemic trauma.
To understand the paper's next big claim, we need to talk about a substance called creatinine. Just think of it as a biological fingerprint for severe trauma. When a body is massively injured and the kidneys start to fail, creatinine levels in the blood just go through the roof.
And this is the paper's next bombshell finding. Using some pretty advanced microscopy, the research reports detecting nanoparticles of that exact substance, creatinine, bound right to the blood-soaked linen fibers. For the author, this is the chemical smoking gun, direct evidence that the man on the shroud suffered a polytrauma consistent with extreme torture.
So the paper connects all the dots to build this incredible medical hypothesis. It starts with torture, which causes this catastrophic organ failure, especially in the kidneys. This floods the blood with waste like creatinine, which in turn causes the red blood cells to shrink down dramatically, and that creates those tiny type A particles. These shrunken cells can't carry oxygen, which starves the body's tissues and forces the heart to work harder and harder until it ultimately just fails. It's a horrifying cascade of systemic collapse, all written at a microscopic level.
But that medical story, as dramatic as it is, isn't the end. The analysis then moves into phenomena that, according to the paper, push the very boundaries of conventional science.
This next finding is, well, it's extraordinary. The paper reports that the type A blood, those shrunken postmortem cells, is radioactive. Specifically, it's emitting beta radiation. The author suggests this could be that unknown event we talked about, the one that could have completely skewed the 1988 carbon dating by creating brand new carbon-14 isotopes right there in the cloth.
And there's more. That very same type A blood also glows under UV light. Normal, ancient blood just doesn't do that. The paper offers a couple of possibilities. It could be from super high levels of a substance called bilirubin, another byproduct of trauma, or it could be yet another effect of that mysterious radiation.
So, okay, let's pull all these strange threads together. We've got the body image, which nobody has ever been able to reproduce. The blood is still reddish, not black and crumbly like typical old blood. And now this research adds two more massive anomalies. The post-mortem blood is both fluorescent and radioactive. The paper proposes that a single powerful event could be responsible for every single one of these things.
And this brings us to the paper's final and most profound conclusion. To account for all of this anomalous data, the image, the fluorescence, the radiation, the messed up carbon date, the author puts forward a hypothesis that steps beyond conventional physics. The resurrection. It is presented not as a statement of religious faith, but as the author's proposed scientific explanation for a unique set of physical evidence.
So we're left with this really powerful question. Does the Turin Shroud simply preserve the tragic, incredible details of a unique medical trauma, a case of suffering so extreme it literally changed the blood of the victim? Or do these strange, radiating, glowing bloodstains point to an event that lies completely outside of our current scientific understanding? That's the question this paper leaves us all to ponder.
The Shroud of Turin, I mean, you've heard of it, right? For centuries, it's been this huge mystery. People argue constantly. Is it a medieval fake, or is it the burial cloth of Jesus? But you know what? Let's just push that whole debate to the side for a minute, because a new series of scientific papers does exactly that. They're not looking at the image, they're not carbon dating the cloth, they're focused on just one thing: the blood. Yeah, that's right. Instead of getting bogged down in the same old arguments, a physicist named Giulio Fanti and his team had a really cool idea. They said, what if we treat these ancient bloodstains like forensic evidence from a modern crime scene? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to follow the clues in what has to be the ultimate cold case. All right, so here we go. Our investigation, it's not starting with that famous ghostly image of a man. Nope, we're zooming in on the dozens of reddish stains you can see all over the cloth. And these aren't just stains. They're forensic evidence of some kind of, well, immense physical trauma. So the researchers got their hands on samples that were actually taken from the shroud way back in 1978. And they put the microscopic particles from inside these stains under the microscope. Their conclusion, it's about as definitive as it gets. The papers literally say there is, and I'm quoting here, no doubt that this stuff is hematic material. In other words, it's real blood and real serum. That's our starting point. Okay, and this is where the forensic work gets really fascinating. Because when Fanti looked closer, he realized something huge. The blood wasn't all the same. He was able to classify it into 3 totally distinct types: A, B, and C. And you got to think of each one as a separate clue. a clue that tells a different part of this man's story. So first up, we have type A blood. And according to Fonte, this is the big one, the most important and definitely the most mysterious. Now this is postmortem blood, which means it seeped out after the person had died. But here's the really weird part, the red blood cells. A normal, healthy red blood cell is around 7 micrometers across. They were shrunken down to as tiny as 0.3 micrometers. I mean, that's a massive difference. Something was just terribly, terribly wrong with this person's blood. And the weirdness didn't stop there. The anomalies just kept piling up. For one thing, normal old blood is dark, right? But this type A blood, it actually glows this weird red-orange color under UV light. On top of that, it gives off low-level beta radiation, that's a type of energy, at levels that are like way higher than you'd ever expect to find. So you have this whole cluster of strange properties. And that becomes the central clue for the entire investigation. Okay, next up is type B. And this one's a lot more straightforward, honestly. You find it in these dark, brittle little fragments. Fonte says this is pre-mortem blood. So think of scabs, basically. It's blood from wounds that had already dried on the skin before the body was ever wrapped in the cloth. It's a direct, physical record of the violence this man suffered while he was still alive. And then finally, you've got type C. Now, this stuff is super rare. They only found it in dust taken from around the facial area. The particles themselves are a little bigger than the type A cells, but they're still shrunken. So the thinking is this might be blood from an earlier stage of the whole ordeal, before the victim's body went into total crisis. So there you have it. 3 types of blood, 3 different sets of clues. And now the investigation takes a turn. We're shifting from just identifying the evidence to figuring out what it all means. What story does it tell? Fonte uses all of this to build a medical profile, to reconstruct the final, agonizing hours of this man's life. Okay, so this lays out the whole chain of events that Fonte proposes. It all starts with the scourging, the whipping. He argues this was so severe it actually caused the man's kidneys to fail. When that happens, your blood gets flooded with toxins, a condition known as uremia. And that's what he thinks made those red blood cells shrink. From there, it's just a tragic domino effect. The shrunken cells can't carry enough oxygen, so the person starts to suffocate. The heart starts racing like crazy to try and make up for it, which leads to congestive heart failure. And the final, fatal event, a heart rupture. It's a complete, step-by-step medical narrative of a death by torture. And it's not just the blood types. There is more microscopic evidence that seems to back this whole story up. For instance, they found fibrin, which is a protein that basically proves the blood was clotting from wounds. They also found really high levels of creatinine, which is a waste product that points to extreme, severe muscle damage. And get this, they even found tiny particles of a specific type of soil that's consistent with the Jerusalem area, which suggests the victim must have fallen, probably more than once. But just when you think the medical picture is becoming crystal clear, the whole investigation hits a wall. A massive forensic paradox. Because when you take all the evidence about what happened after death, when the body was supposedly in the tomb, you run into a huge, huge problem. This is exactly where the case goes from being just a terrible tragedy to a mind-bending paradox. The evidence tells us 3 conflicting things. First, the body was stiff with rigor mortis, right? So it's rigid. Second, there are absolutely no smears on any of the bloodstains, not even the ones that were still wet when the body was wrapped. Think about that. How do you get a stiff body out of a cloth without smearing anything? And third, there are 0 signs of decomposition, which means the body had to have been gone in under 40, maybe 48 hours. It didn't decay. It just vanished. And all of that leads us to the single most baffling question of this entire forensic investigation. If you have a rigid body wrapped up tightly in a cloth, and it wasn't unwrapped, and it wasn't pulled or dragged out, then how in the world did it get out? It's the ultimate locked room mystery, isn't it? All right, and this is where the investigation goes from forensic science to, well, something else entirely. Fonte is faced with this paradox that just seems to defy the laws of physics as we know them. So he proposes a solution that he himself admits is, quote, out of science. He's basically saying, the clues are forcing us to look for an explanation that's beyond our current scientific understanding. So how does he resolve this paradox of the stiff body and the perfectly unsmeared blood? Well, he reaches a truly extraordinary conclusion, and I think it's best to just quote him directly here. He writes, quote, the physical body of Jesus became transparent to the linen fabric. In other words, he's suggesting the body became immaterial. It just passed right through. Fante's hypothesis boils down to this: an immense, unimaginable burst of energy. He argues that this energy is the key to everything. It's what created that faint body image on the cloth, it's what caused that bizarre radioactivity in the type A blood, and it's what momentarily allowed the physical body to pass straight through the fibers of the lemon without disturbing them. And he doesn't mince words. He explicitly connects this theoretical energy event to the resurrection as described in the Gospels. So think about this journey we've just taken. A forensic trail that started with tiny microscopic particles of blood has led us all the way to a conclusion that challenges the very nature of matter and reality. And it really just leaves us with this one profound question to ponder. What happens when all the scientific evidence, all the data, points to a conclusion that lies beyond the limits of science itself?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping headfirst into a really fascinating scientific paper. It's all about the Turin Shroud, one of the biggest mysteries of all time. And the conclusion this paper reaches, well, the author himself calls it scientifically absurd. So we have to dig into this. Let's see what's going on.
So, the Turin Shroud. It's been this source of fascination and, honestly, a massive headache for researchers for centuries, right? You've got this cloth with a faint but incredibly detailed image of a crucified man on it, both the front and the back. But here's the kicker. The real mystery isn't just what the image is, it's how in the world it got there. To this day, our best science, all our modern tech, can't replicate it. And that's exactly where this paper we're looking at kicks off. The author, Giulio Fanti, he basically says, look, from the get-go, the way this image is made, its unique features, we just can't reproduce it. I mean, this isn't some old painting, right? It's not a scorch mark either. All the evidence seems to point to it being something else entirely. All right, so let's get into it. How does the author start building his case? Well, he zeroes in on 3 really specific forensic clues that he says are basically sealed right into the fibers of the cloth itself. Okay, so these are the 3 big ones. The whole argument in the paper really hangs on these 3 observations. And when you put them all together, they start to paint a picture that, it just doesn't fit with any normal explanation for how you'd get a body out of a burial shroud. Okay, let's start with the first clue, because this one is wild. The author points out that the blood stains on the shroud, and get this, some of the blood was apparently still wet when it transferred. They have absolutely 0 smearing. None. The patterns are just perfectly imprinted, almost like a stamp. And that is a really crucial point, right? Think about it. If you were to unwrap a body or just pull the cloth off, you'd get smears, you'd get smudges. It's inevitable. But here, nothing. The only way that could happen, the author argues, is if the body was put in the shroud and then just wasn't moved at all. All right, clue number 2. The paper highlights the fact that there are no stains from decomposition gases. Now, this is a big deal because as a body starts to break down, it releases all this nasty stuff, corrosive gases that would absolutely leave a mark on the linen, especially around the mouth and nose. But on the shroud, not a single trace. So you take the lack of decay, you combine it with the fact that the body was in rigor mortis, and you can actually calculate a very specific window of time. The author figures the body could only have been inside that cloth for about 36 to 40 hours. That's just enough time for rigor mortis to kick in, but it's before the real decomposition process would have started. And then, here's where it gets really interesting. The author points out that this time frame, this 36 to 40-hour window that he came to through science, it just so happens to line up perfectly with the biblical account, a death on Friday and the discovery of an empty tomb on Sunday morning. All right, so where does all this lead? Let's look at how these clues come together to form a pretty extraordinary deduction. Because what we have is evidence that seems to lock the body in place, and yet the body isn't there anymore. So let's just quickly run through the evidence the author lays out. You've got a corpse that's stiff with rigor mortis. It hasn't been moved at all. There are no signs of decay. It's wrapped up tight in this cloth, and somehow it's just gone, vanished from inside it. That's a huge puzzle, both logically and scientifically. And that really brings us to the heart of the whole paper. It's the big question. If the body wasn't unwrapped and it didn't just rot away, then how did it get out? How did it leave the shroud without a single trace of its exit? And this is where the author drops his bombshell conclusion. He says that when you look at all the evidence, there's only one deduction that fits. And he knows how strange this is going to sound, but he says the body must have passed through the cloth, that it somehow became transparent and just went right through the shroud. Okay, so how could that even be possible? To try and explain this, the paper puts forward a hypothesis that, and I love this, it openly admits is currently out of science. He calls it the transparency of matter, and the core idea is pretty mind-bending. It suggests that a massive, massive burst of energy could, in theory, allow a physical object, like a body, to pass straight through another physical object, like a linen cloth, without disturbing it at all. No interaction, no damage. Now, to help us wrap our heads around this, the author uses a pretty cool analogy from basic physics. You know, we look at a table or a wall, and we see it as solid, but if you zoom all the way down to the atomic level, matter is actually almost entirely empty space. So the logic goes like this. If some kind of powerful energy event could somehow navigate the atoms of the body through all those empty spaces between the atoms of the cloth, well, then the body could pass right through. Look, it's a giant theoretical leap, no question, but it's the mechanism the author puts forward to try and make sense of the evidence. But wait, it gets even wilder. The paper then does something even more audacious. It takes this one super speculative idea and tries to use it to explain another major event that science can't really explain. So the author argues that if this whole transparency of matter thing could explain how Jesus' body left the shroud, then maybe, just maybe, the exact same physical principle could explain the virgin birth, specifically the belief that Mary remained physically a virgin during the act of childbirth. And boom, that's the full scope of his thesis right there. He's basically suggesting that a single physical phenomenon, this transparency of matter, could potentially explain two of the most central miraculous events in Christianity. He's linking the resurrection and the virgin birth with one single, unified, albeit out of science, hypothesis. So let's just recap the whole argument here. The author starts with hard forensic evidence from the shroud itself, right? No blood smears, no decay. This forces him toward a conclusion that he himself admits sounds impossible by today's science. The body passed through the cloth. From there, he proposes this transparency of matter idea, and then, for good measure, uses it to also explain the virgin birth.
Look, in the end, this paper isn't claiming it has all the answers. Not at all. What it's really doing is pushing right up against the boundaries of what we think science can even talk about. And it leaves us with a really deep question, one that sits at the intersection of faith and evidence. What is science supposed to do when all the clues you can physically measure seem to point to a conclusion that, for now, you just can't explain?